We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to this special crossover episode of After America and the Presidency Pending podcast, brought to you today by the Australia Institute and the Faculty of Arts at Deakin University. I'm Dr. Emma Shortis. I'm Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute, and I'm joined today by the co-hosts of Presidency Pending. I'm so pleased to welcome back Associate Professor Nwokora from the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin. Zim, thanks so much for being here.
It's great to be back on your show, Emma. Thank you for the invitation.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure to share a show as well today. And we're also joined by Zim's excellent co-host and my friend, Associate Professor Claire Corbould, who's Associate Head of School Research in the Faculty of Arts and Education, also at Deakin University. Claire, thanks so much for joining us. I'm so glad to finally have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Emma.
Pleasure's all ours. So I thought we'd jump right in with a super easy question. I had Chaz Licciardello on the show yesterday, and he was pretty firm, and I think has been pretty firm for a while, in saying that the trends of the election, like the kind of broader trends, if we forget about polling just for a moment because it's so close, the trends favour Donald Trump. And he basically argued that the election is already over unless something drastic happens, unless the polling is way out, that it's over and it's trending towards Trump. So I wanted to start with that easy question. Maybe I'll start with you, Claire. What do you reckon?
I have come to the conclusion that at this point, asking people to predict the result is more a question about their own psychological makeup and their ability to suppress their desires to be optimistic or pessimistic more than anything else. But having said that, I'll have a go. I think that the trend also has been over the past few years to underestimate the impact of the reversal of the Dobbs Supreme Court decision and women's access to reproductive health care of all sorts, not just abortion, but IVF and all of those things that are now quite evidently under threat. And, you know, as I said, this is a psychological test as well, but my thinking is that that's going to get Harris over the line. And there are some other trends that point toward that, and one is that Trump needs young men to come out to vote. They are notoriously the hardest group to get out to vote, just as they were many years ago when I was a market researcher. They were the group we were always looking for on Sunday afternoons at the end of the weekly research into milk, which was a longitudinal study that the company I worked for did. You could never find 18 to 25-year-olds. They did not want to talk to someone about milk for 10 minutes. Likewise, they are the least likely to come out and vote. Harris obviously also needs to mobilise young people, and particularly young women, in bigger proportions than they normally vote, but they might be moved more than that other group.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Claire. And I think, you know, we saw reproductive rights particularly be underestimated as a mobilising factor in the lead up to the 2022 midterms. And I think you're right, we can't kind of untangle all of those issues from the polling. Zim, what's your take on it?
The funny thing about this point in this election cycle is I think that there are a large range of very plausible outcomes going from Harris comfortable win to Trump comfortable win, none of which would massively surprise me at the moment. And that's because a lot of the indicators seem to be pointing in quite different directions. The polls are close, but if you look at the sports bet markets, they're favoring Trump. If you look at other indicators, you know, the level of ground activity, that seems to be favoring Harris in several states. So I think that there's really mixed trends that make it quite difficult to draw a firm prediction. A lot of the people who seem to be saying really strong predictions, I suspect, are undertaking what is in effect a psychological exercise. It's a projection thing. It's kind of, well, they're expressing to some extent their preference. And so I think we got to take a step back and ask, well, what is the best data that we have? And some of that data is from independent polling. Of course, it's flawed. Some of the sense of the race we can get from watching the candidates and what they're doing, because presumably they're acting on the basis of internal polling that's often more accurate and more reliable. But even then, watching their activities is not necessarily gives us a clear sense of their expectations either. I mean, just look at Trump's Madison Garden rally. I'm confused as to whether that's a sign that he's really confident about his chances, or in fact is fairly fatalistic about losing and probably wants to claim the mantle one last final time before the end of his kind of elite political career. I'm not sure. I mean, I've read both of those interpretations, and I think there's a degree of plausibility in either of them. So, to cut a long story short, I think this is one of the more confusing end games that we've seen in presidential election politics for a long time.
The Republican Party's been successful in building a different coalition, since the 1970s, much to often the befuddlement of people who look at working class voters and think, why would they vote for the Republican Party? But, it's something that W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous African-American sociologist, said a long time ago, partly. It's about the wages of whiteness, which was his answer to the perennial question, why don't white working class people build coalitions with black working class people since the 1930s? And why aren't the socialists in power? And the answer is people get some pleasure or satisfaction from imagining themselves to be part of an elite group or a superior group or whatever it is. He called it the wages of whiteness. And the Republicans have obviously capitalized on that since the 1970s extremely well. And in fact, it looks like they may actually be extending that now to second-generation Latino voters and to young black men as well. That, these are people who feel, who are often at a disadvantage. As Zim reminded us all at an event last night, working class wages and lower middle class wages have not moved really since the 1970s, as other people have got, more and more extensively wealthy. That unusual period from the 1950s to early 1970s of relative wealth equality was a blip. But it was a good one, and it's one that many people would like to go back to. And so, and obviously Trump has even more than, say, George W. Bush, who am I thinking of? Reagan, obviously Nixon. He's tapped into it incredibly well.
Just, Claire, I really welcome the historical shift. I think that's very healthy when thinking about these trends, very useful lens. And I was just thinking as you were talking about the collapse of, well, I wouldn't say collapse at this point, but the evidence that there has been some erosion in what used to be really strong democratic communities. So Black Americans are not voting for Harris at the proportions we expect. Hispanic Americans, again, similarly being peeled off by Trump. So that coalition that used to be very solidly democratic is no longer so. As you've pointed out, some of the historical trends there. But if we get really fine-grained about it, I think a really good case study of all of this is what's happened to Florida. I was just thinking, in some respects, I think 2000 has parallels with the race we're in at the moment. But of course, that all turned on Florida. That was a contentious state then. Florida is not contentious anymore. It's no longer a swing state. It's very much in the Republican column. And it's a state where that's happened because the Latino population, to varying extents, has moved toward the Republican Party. And I think that's a really, really interesting set of trends. Of course, I've read that the Democratic Party has made a lot of tactical blunders in that state as well. But there has been a sense in which Trump and the MAGA movement have been able to peel off a certain kind of minority by saying, look, you can be one of us so long as you accept that there's a naughty, nasty, bad them. You have to buy our narrative, buy our argument, and then you can be part of this grand, pure sense of America that we're trying to nurture. And that's appealing to some people, that even if they are from communities that have historically been marginalized in the American society and public life.
I mean, I think you're right, and we do need to look at individual states very often. And the counterpoint to Florida is probably Georgia or North Carolina. But there are a couple of things about Florida that are a little bit unusual in that, we talk sometimes about a Latino vote or a Latino population, but that one is more dominated by Cubans than most Latino population, and they have always actually voted more conservatively than as you well know, than lots of Latino voters. And the other thing to talk about there, and this isn't unique to Florida, but it has had an impact on switching it from a swing state, is the fact that convicted felons are often unable to vote for the rest of time in many states. Now, activism around this issue has pulled it back over the last 5 or 6 years, so that the numbers actually of people who are prevented from voting for life has reduced, which has been a really important, I think, action to re-enfranchise and to improve the civic life and the chance of a fair vote. People still have to come out and vote, of course, but at least they have some opportunity to do so. So it's a bit of give and take. There are all kinds of methods that mostly Republican state legislatures have used to try to really, I mean, there's no other word for it, rig the vote. But that was one. And certainly I think in the year 2000, I mean, I think there were enough, were enough convicted people who would tend Democrat at that point that Gore would have won the presidency easily. Not easily, but he would have won Florida without question. I mean, he did win Florida.
True.
He did.
True. But of course, the United States incarcerates a lot of people. So this is we're talking millions of people. This is large numbers.
Indeed. Yes. New York, luckily for Donald Trump, is not somewhere that prevents convicted felons from voting forever. I'm not sure whether imprisoned felons can vote there or not. I'd have to look that up. Anyway, that's something we can discuss perhaps at the next election.
Yeah.
And every time anyone mentions Florida and 2000, a little shiver goes down my spine. It's kind of scary to even you can't look at it directly.
Emma, I haven't listened to yesterday's podcast yet, but what do you think about Chaz's kind of certainty about Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of your points about it being a psychological test, could not be more accurate. I find it impossible at the moment to kind of untangle my own instincts and my own emotional investment in it. Just given what is at stake, not just for the United States, but for Australia as well. So much is at stake for the rest of the world. So with that kind of caveat, and absolutely with Claire's caveat about not making predictions, my instinct is that it does trend towards Trump. I think that the Harris campaign had such an opportunity to capitalize on that joy and the shift in vibes, that we talked about, Zim, a little while ago now, but I don't think it's backed that up with enough substance, with offering enough change. The Democratic Party has this problem of offering kind of technocratic, tinkery solutions to what are structural problems in American politics. And I think people recognize that. And Trump is so good at capitalizing on, the kind of ingrained white grievance around that. And that couldn't have been more clear than it was at Madison Square Garden, where there's that kind of parade of aggressive white grievance, in contrast, of course, to Harris's rally and Beyonce finally appearing, but I think on balance, probably Chaz is right, and that's not enough. Beyonce is not going to shift it. But then again, as Claire said, we've underestimated turnout a number of times, and African Americans in particular have been asked so many times to kind of save the Democrats for themselves, and they've done it many times. So yeah, I'm not sure. Like, do you guys think Beyonce is going to have an influence? Do you think that matters? Because the Beyonce rally was kind of weird. I thought it was a little bit understated. It wasn't it wasn't the kind of huge moment that I think many people were expecting.
Yeah, and I, it just, we puzzled over why Donald Trump would go to Madison Square Garden, and in retrospect, it seems absolutely obvious why. It brought out tens of thousands of people. It made for a televisual spectacle. They had a racist comment who made dreadful, remarks about Puerto Rico, which may backfire on them, and that's another one of my little hopes now. Having learned that there are 200,000 Puerto Rican voters in Pennsylvania, which is a very close state, let's hope. But I think going to your original question, you see I'm clinging to hope here. But, and that plus McDonald's last week in his stupid tie just has put Harris's campaign right in the shade. Right? I mean, he just knows how to work media, to earn that media and to get the replays and the likes and the memes and all the rest of it. He just is so good at it. And Harris's campaign was so good for a minute at the beginning of her run. And unfortunately, they just seem to have shrunk. Shrunk? I think that's the word I want. Shrunk.
Yeah.
Been diminished.
Builds on what you've both said about the Harris campaign losing momentum. What in particular should they have done differently? Like, how could they have stayed? How could they have kept that trajectory going?
She's great with people, all those clips that we saw, especially with young people. She's really great with them. Had she had a bit longer, that might have helped.
Okay.
So, perhaps if Biden had done what he said in 2020 he would do and stepped down earlier, or made way. I mean, would she have won a primary contest? Possibly not, because of the fear that her race and gender would just be too much to win over the American electorate. Maybe she would not have won a primary, but maybe a couple of months extra might have helped. So that's one answer I have to that. But okay, but you're really asking what could they have done given these circumstances? And at this point, I'll go to Emma.
Oh, gee, thanks. Look, I think I've spoken to Don Watson about this before, and his point is that part of what Democrats have failed to do, and it's not on Harris, it's a kind of party-wide structural problem, is take ownership for their own failures, to take ownership for the 1990s and the kind of decimation of American manufacturing and of the Rust Belt, to say, basically, we got that wrong and here's how we're going to fix it. I'm not sure if that's fair, or, it's easy to say that from the outside, that if they just did this one thing, then, they'd be able to win. But I think it is that kind of failure to really address structural inequality, and they can't do that because, as Watson says, they're kind of up to their necks in American capitalism just as much as the Republican Party is, and their inability to kind of extract themselves, I think, from that is kind of why we find ourselves in the situation that we are in. And I think partly it may also come down to the Democrats' failure, again, to kind of listen to their own more progressive base. I think particularly in Michigan, Harris's refusal to differentiate herself from Biden on Israel and on the United States' role in the world may prove to be absolutely critical, and I've said that a number of times. So, I think that there's that kind of number of factors, but what it really comes down to is offering substance. It's offering substantial change that Americans are clearly crying out for, as opposed to that kind of tinkering and vibes. Like, vibes are important, they're critical, but it's that failure to back them up with something real, I think.
So that's not on Harris, is it? That is a longer. It's the trend rightward of the entirety of the West.
But it's not entirely on Harris, but I think as the challenge has been framed by you both, it's harder for her to be that candidate of profound change, just given her identity in the Biden administration. It's hard for her to repudiate those policies, as you're saying, Emma. I mean, that distance that ideally she should have been able to draw between her manifesto for change and what the Biden administration is doing. That's a really difficult political problem to navigate. And who knows what, I mean, I wonder, because this is obviously a complicated game in the sense that the next thing that happens as soon as a candidate says, I don't like Biden's policy on Israel-Palestine, is that Biden gets asked, oh, well, what do you think of your vice president's remarks on that? And then he's got an interesting problem to solve, because obviously he wants Harris to win, but on what terms? Is he prepared to accept her winning while repudiating his presidency? Or is his position that he's happy with her to win, but don't disrespect me? And that's the terms on which he endorses her and supports her candidacy and so on. In which case she's got very little wiggle room. And then, of course, how willingly is she prepared to embrace a more radical position than the administration she served in? All these questions are open ones. And I think it's interesting that probably her instinct seems to be, when confronted with a constellation of complex choices, to be cautious. And I sort of get that, given her who she is and the challenges of her political career. But she's not what I describe as a bold actor. And I think her default is to retreat to positions that are relatively pragmatic and cautious and so on. And that all makes a lot of sense, I think, from the standpoint of good governance. I just fear that in a campaign of this type, that's not necessarily the framework of thinking that is ideal, because Trump is such an unusual kind of unicorn candidate. Maybe you need someone who's prepared to match his boldness, but in a different direction.
Which I think we had with Biden in 2020, and I think I think you've really hit on something there, Zim, which is she's either needed him to be rock solid behind her over the last couple of months. Yes, she might have a different policy on X, but I'm totally for that because this will be her presidency, not mine. Things change. Let's move on. And also, he should be going from town to small town in Pennsylvania, just pressing the flesh if he can. Maybe he is. If he is, I'm not seeing it particularly, but that might be, I may have missed it. But that's what she's needed. And actually, he's gone to Berlin.
Certainly. I mean, the one thing that he could do for her would be to bring Pennsylvania into her column. More than anything else. And he could. I mean, he more than anyone else has that. Has
and
that
Michigan,
capacity.
Wisconsin, he could have a go there too. They like him there.
Perhaps. Yep.
Bruce Springsteen might help with that too.
Let's hope so. Yeah.
True.
So have I missed it? Is Biden? What is he doing?
He is there out there. I saw a clip of him voting the other day. I'm not sure where it was, but he's voted and voted early, so he's out there. But I think it's also a case, Claire, that you've missed it because everybody's just forgotten about Biden. He's not in the media. Nobody's talking about the current president, and so him even getting cut through at the moment, I think, is incredibly difficult. Precisely because of what you outlined. That Trump is so good at manipulating the media cycle. I wanted to, speaking of voting, I guess, and early voting, I wanted to ask you both as a kind of final question, given that we're so close now, scarily close, what it is you'll be looking for on election day. What are the indications you're looking for about, whether you should be trusting your gut or not?
Well, when I was watching the results for the 2016 election between Trump and Hillary Clinton coming in, I was having lunch with a Monash colleague, watching the big Jumbotron TV on campus there. He grew up in Virginia. As soon as those first numbers started to come in from the East Coast, he was despondent. Absolutely, could barely get anything out of him. And I said, don't be ridiculous. Everyone says Hillary's going to win. Every poll says Clinton's going to get romped this in. Well, so I'll be looking at those early numbers and texting Josh for his advice. I'm obviously kidding. I'll be looking for the proportion of women voting, going back to my earlier comment. So any exit polling that indicates any kind of upward trend in women voting, I'll be confident that means they're breaking for Harris. And likewise, not that, and college-educated people. So we were talking before about the various coalitions and who has the working class vote and what have you, but that's the other really, really big split now. I think is it? I heard the other day 61% of people who have a 4-year college degree or more vote Democrat, and 56% of people who don't vote Republican. So if we can get any early data on that, then that would help too. Other than that, I'll be going on the vibes. Over to you two.
Vibes are important. Zim?
Good question. So I'll be looking at indicators of a couple of things. Firstly, indicators of the election outcome, and a bit like Claire, I'll be looking at those early states and seeing how things are breaking there. In terms of the groups, I think who are the undecideds going to break for, I think is an interesting question. Obviously, in a polarized era, there isn't a huge number of them anymore, but I think they could be very important in this last week or so in the run up to the final election day on November the 5th. The second set of indicators I'm looking at, and I was just thinking about this morning while reading the news, is indicators of the potential for political violence. And there I was reading about the ballot drop box being burned in Portland, Oregon, and I think similar incident in Washington state as well. So I'll be interested to see how, even during these days before the final election day, how peaceful and smooth the process is going in the different states, and just as importantly, how the people who are responsible for the management of elections respond. So I think all of that activity will be important, particularly if the election result is close, which is, I think, well within the realms of possibility.
It is, and there are so many things to watch out for, so many threads, I suppose, to untangle in the knot that is American politics. So we will keep waiting and keep watching. And in the meantime, Nwokora and Claire Corbould, thank you so much for joining us on this special crossover episode of After America and Presidency Pending.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Emma. Can't wait to see your casts from stateside.
Thanks so much. Thank you, guys. This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 30th of October, and no doubt a lot will have changed since then. If you're enjoying After America, please help us spread the word by telling your friends about the show. And you can find us on social media. We are at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Twitter and Instagram. And you can reach out to us with feedback and episode ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. And if you want to hear more from the Australia Institute, you can subscribe for regular updates via the link in the show notes. You can also subscribe to Claire and Zim's show, Presidency Pending, wherever you get your podcasts. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm jumping on a plane tomorrow, so Thursday Australian time, which means there might be a little break in programming, but hold tight and we'll be back in your feeds really soon. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.